On the 6th of October, 1939, a Polish countess stepped off a ship into wartime London. Within weeks, the Secret Intelligence Service opened a file describing her as a flaming Polish patriot, expert skier, absolutely fearless. At that point, Britain's Special Operations Executive did not yet exist. When it was later formed in July 1940, it would eventually control around 13,000 personnel worldwide, including about 3,200 women, but only a small fraction of those women would ever be sent into enemy-occupied territory as field agents. Krystyna Skarbek, soon to be known as Christine Granville, would become both the first woman Britain sent into the field and one of its longest-serving agents, operating continuously from late 1939 through 1945 in Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, the Middle East, and France. This narrative traces, step by step, how her missions across the Carpathians, through Budapest safe houses, and into the Alps of southeastern France produced measurable effects on German deployments, and why a decorated agent ended the war demobilized and murdered in peacetime London. The same file that praised her courage also sat in a bureaucracy that, by 1946, would struggle to find her a basic civilian job. Parish and civil records noting the 1st of May, 1908, mark the birth of Krystyna Skarbek, daughter of Count Jerzy Skarbek, and a mother from a Jewish banking family, raised on landed estates in Russian partition Poland. The family's history stretched back through centuries of Polish nobility, yet the world into which she was born would barely survive 3 decades. Warsaw in 1908 stood at the heart of a partitioned nation, where Polish identity persisted despite foreign rule. Her childhood combined aristocratic privilege with the cultural complexity of a family that bridged Polish Catholic tradition and Jewish commercial heritage. By 1918, Poland had regained independence after 123 years of partition. The Second Polish Republic emerged from the ruins of 3 empires, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, with borders contested on all sides. The young state faced immediate challenges: war with Soviet Russia in 1920, economic instability, and ethnic tensions among a population of roughly 35 million that included Ukrainians, Jews, Germans, and Belarusians alongside ethnic Poles. Military traditions ran deep, yet material resources remained limited. Skarbek's early life reflected this tension between tradition and modernity. Convent education provided linguistic skills. She spoke Polish, French, and German fluently, with working knowledge of English and Italian. In her 20s, she worked in an automobile showroom in Warsaw, participated in the 1930 Miss Polonia beauty contest, and married twice, first to businessman Karol Getlich, ending in divorce, then to diplomat Jerzy Gajicki in 1938. This second marriage positioned her within diplomatic circles and near the routes that would later prove crucial. Contemporary photographs show a striking woman with aristocratic bearing, athletic build, and intense eyes, traits that would serve her well in clandestine work. Poland's armed forces in 1939 totaled approximately 1 million men upon full mobilization, organized into 30 regular infantry divisions, 11 reserve infantry divisions, and 12 cavalry brigades. Armored strength remained minimal, fewer than 900 tanks and tankettes, most obsolete by Western standards. The Air Force fielded roughly 400 combat aircraft against Germany's Luftwaffe of over 4,000. Polish planners understood these limitations but counted on French offensive action in the West and British support. Intelligence structures existed, but operated under severe resource constraints, a gap that would later make courier networks like Skarbek's invaluable. Biographical summaries from British intelligence files later describe her as an accomplished horsewoman and skier, skills acquired through years of winter sports in the Tatra Mountains. These were not mere recreational accomplishments, they represented physical capability and mountain navigation experience that few agents possessed. Her knowledge of Carpathian passes, weather patterns, and local populations would prove directly applicable to operational requirements. The German invasion began on the 1st of September, 1939, with over 1.5 million troops crossing Polish borders from the west, north, and south. Soviet forces invaded from the east on the 17th of September. Within 5 weeks, organized Polish resistance collapsed. Tens of thousands of Polish servicemen found themselves in prisoner of war camps or interned in neutral countries. The government fled first to Romania, then to France, and eventually Britain. Skarbek and Gijicki, outside Poland when the invasion began, sailed for Britain on a commercial vessel, arriving safely while their homeland disappeared from the map of independent nations. While most Polish officers headed for internment in Romania or German captivity, one Polish countess arrived in London already searching for a way back into the war. Not as a nurse or clerk, but as an operational agent. The contrast would define her service. Most exiles sought conventional military roles. She sought the unconventional path that would take her, within months, back across enemy lines. An SIS office file dated December 1939 records the first internal note on Skarbek, describing her as a flaming Polish patriot, expert skier, and great adventuress, absolutely fearless. The assessment came from journalist Frederick Augustus Voigt, who championed her proposal to Section D of the Secret Intelligence Service, the section responsible for sabotage and subversion before SOE's creation. British officials initially expected Polish exiles to serve within conventional military units being formed in France and Britain. Female volunteers, in particular, faced assignment to clerical roles, nursing, or auxiliary services. The concept of sending a woman on clandestine missions into occupied territory ran counter to institutional practice. Section D officers, however, recognized the value of her specific combination of attributes: native Polish speaker with excellent French and German, intimate knowledge of Carpathian geography, physical fitness for mountain operations, and family connections that might provide cover and contacts inside occupied territory. They approved a plan for a courier line running from Hungary into occupied Poland. Official cover would designate her as a journalist based in Budapest. Actual operations would involve crossing the Slovak frontier and skiing into German-occupied Poland, carrying propaganda materials, funds, and microfilmed intelligence reports. The operational concept required crossing high-altitude mountain passes in winter conditions. The Tatra Range along the Polish-Slovak border rises above 2,000 meters, with numerous passes between 1,500 and 2,000 meters elevation. Winter temperatures frequently dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Snow depth could reach several meters. German and Slovak border patrols operated regularly, though the mountainous terrain and extreme weather limited their effectiveness. The consequences of capture under German martial law were clear: summary execution for espionage. Local support proved essential. Polish underground networks had begun forming almost immediately after the September defeat. Among the key figures was Jan Marusarz, an Olympic skier and mountain guide who knew every pass and trail in the Tatras. Later reports identify him and his brother Stanisław as guides on multiple crossings. These men represented a critical asset. They could navigate in whiteout conditions, avoid known patrol routes, and make judgment calls about avalanche risk and weather windows. Without such expertise, the courier line would have failed in its first attempt. Historical accounts summarize the system she established as a network of Polish couriers, bringing reports from Warsaw to Budapest. The intelligence covered German troop movements, morale assessments, details of occupation policies, and, critically, rail traffic patterns. This information reached SIS headquarters months before any formal SOE structure existed, providing early warning of German dispositions that would prove strategically significant. The physical act of each crossing combined endurance, skill, and calculated risk. A typical mission involved traveling from Budapest to the Slovak frontier, making contact with guides, waiting for weather conditions that balanced visibility with patrol avoidance, then skiing across exposed ridges and through forested approaches to reach drop points inside Poland. There, contacts would provide material for exfiltration, microfilm, written reports, occasionally small items like the W-35 anti-tank rifle that would later surface in her Budapest apartment. The return journey reversed the route, carrying British funds, propaganda, and instructions outbound. German commanders treated the Carpathian frontier as a natural barrier, adequate to control population movement with modest forces. The assumption was reasonable. Few individuals possessed the combination of motivation, physical capability, and local knowledge to attempt winter crossings. Yet by early 1940, a Polish countess was crossing it repeatedly, carrying British intelligence materials in her rucksack and proving that determined individuals with proper support could overcome barriers that appeared insurmountable on strategic maps. Hungarian police and German diplomatic reports from 1940 through 41 began referencing Polish underground activity in Budapest as SIS, and the Polish resistance built a hub in the Hungarian capital. Budapest offered several advantages: officially neutral with diplomatic missions from both Allied and Axis powers, positioned astride Danube River traffic, and connected by rail to Poland, Romania, and the Balkans. Hungary maintained complex relationships with Germany, alliance against common enemies, but also reservation about German domination. This ambiguity created operational space. Berlin expected neutral Hungary to suppress Allied intelligence work and maintain security for the Ploiești-Germany oil corridor. British planners saw precisely the opposite opportunity: a listening post on Danube traffic, Romanian oil movements, and Wehrmacht deployments toward the Balkans. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești supplied perhaps 30% of German petroleum needs. Rail lines and river barges moved this oil north through Hungarian territory toward German refineries and Wehrmacht depots. Monitoring this flow became a priority intelligence requirement. Andrzej Kowerski entered the network as both operational partner and, eventually, life companion. A pre-war cavalry officer, he had lost part of a leg in the 1939 fighting, but retained full mobility with a prosthetic. His engineering background and calm temperament complemented Skarbek's more impulsive style. Together, they organized courier lines from Warsaw to Budapest, coordinated safe houses, managed drops of funds and materials, and compiled intelligence reports for transmission to London. The partnership proved effective. Kowerski handled much of the technical work and liaison with Polish military intelligence, while Skarbek conducted the high-risk courier runs. MI6's requirement to monitor Romanian oil movements demanded systematic observation. Reports needed to quantify traffic, tank car frequencies on specific rail lines, barge convoy sizes moving up the Danube, intervals between movements, and any changes in patterns that might indicate shifts in German supply priorities or production disruptions at Ploiești. This intelligence fed into broader British assessments of German petroleum logistics, a critical vulnerability in the German war machine. The network established observation posts near rail yards and river crossings, recruited local sources with access to transportation schedules, and developed methods to photograph traffic without detection. Among the more unusual episodes documented in later accounts is the temporary presence of a Polish WZ-35 anti-tank rifle in their Budapest flat. The weapon, a large-caliber rifle designed to penetrate light armored vehicles, had been smuggled out of Poland as a potential asset. Plans apparently existed to provide technical documentation to British ordnance experts. In practice, the rifle became something of a dead end. Western manufacturing capacity for such weapons already existed, and Polish production facilities were under German control. The weapon sat hidden in their apartment, representing good intentions without practical effect, a reminder that not every intelligence operation yields strategic value. In January 1941, Hungarian authorities arrested Skarbek and Kowarski under Gestapo pressure. The Gestapo had been tracking their network's activities and pressed Hungarian police to detain them pending transfer to German custody. During interrogation, Skarbek employed a desperate improvisation. She bit her tongue hard enough to produce blood, then coughed it up repeatedly during medical examinations. A Hungarian prison doctor, believing she had advanced tuberculosis, diagnosed her as terminally ill. Hungarian authorities, unwilling to allow a death in custody that might complicate relations with Britain, released both prisoners on humanitarian grounds. Later accounts characterize this as remarkable presence of mind under interrogation. SOE and MI6 files note the incident as evidence of her composure under pressure and willingness to employ extreme measures. The release came with a clear message. Continued operations in Hungary had become untenable. German surveillance had intensified, Hungarian tolerance for Allied activity was diminishing, and the risk of arrest without release was rising. Yet the network had already sent key intelligence to London, including reports on German military concentrations near the Soviet border. Among those reports was one that London initially dismissed as alarmist, detailed observations of Wehrmacht divisions moving toward positions along the Soviet frontier. British analysts, aware of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and skeptical that Germany would open a two-front war, gave the reports limited credence. Within months, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa would vindicate the warnings. But by then, Skarbek and Kowarski were already in flight toward Cairo. British diplomatic correspondence from early 1941 records Ambassador Sir Owen O'Malley arranging exit papers for Skarbek and Kowarski under assumed identities. The documents gave them new names: Christine Granville and Andrew Kennedy. Her birth year was falsified, reducing her age by 5 years from 33 to 28, a detail that would follow her through SOE records and ultimately to her death certificate. The false identities served dual purposes: operational security and legal protection, as they transited territories increasingly under Axis influence or control. Axis intelligence services expected that once high-value Allied agents were identified, neutral states would cooperate in preventing their escape. Yet British diplomats exploited legal exit channels and the lag in centralized Axis coordination. With British passports in hand, Skarbek and Kowarski drove an Opel automobile from Budapest through Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, then via Turkey and the Levant to Egypt. The route covered hundreds of kilometers through territories that ranged from technically neutral to actively sympathetic with Germany. Contemporary maps show German forces advancing across the Balkans even as they drove south, at times only days ahead of Wehrmacht units. Their journey required crossing multiple frontiers, obtaining visas from reluctant officials, and maintaining cover under increasing scrutiny. At the Syrian frontier, Vichy French authorities controlled entry, France having signed an armistice with Germany in June 1940. British diplomatic pressure and careful presentation of credentials eventually secured transit through Syria and Lebanon into British-controlled Palestine, then onward to Cairo. The entire escape took months, demonstrating both resourcefulness and the fragility of intelligence networks once compromised. Arrival in Cairo by mid-1941 brought them under Middle East Command and into contact with the Special Operations Executive. Britain had created SOE in July 1940, consolidating various sabotage and subversion cells, including Section D, which had originally recruited Skarbek, into a unified organization tasked with supporting resistance movements and conducting irregular warfare. SOE reported directly to the Minister of Economic Warfare and operated parallel to, but separately from SIS, creating jurisdictional tensions that would persist throughout the war. The organizational shift from SIS to SOE meant Skarbek now fell under a more structured training and deployment system. She joined the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, FNY, a British women's voluntary organization that served as administrative cover for many SOE female agents. Fanny records show her attending courses in weapons handling, wireless operation, security procedures, and parachute training. Instructor reports praised her courage, physical fitness, and language capabilities. They also noted persistent problems, poor wireless discipline, dislike of firearms practice, and what multiple evaluators called her tendency to be a law unto herself. SOE veteran Vera Atkins later described her as very brave, attractive, and a loner. The combination troubled some headquarters staff. Field operations demanded initiative and improvisation, qualities Skarbek possessed in abundance. Headquarters planning relied on agents following briefings and maintaining operational security through discipline, areas where reports suggest she sometimes chafed at restrictions. Her performance kept her on deployment lists, but concerns over unpredictability delayed actual assignment. SOE's overall strength approached 13,000 personnel worldwide by mid-war, including approximately 3,200 women. Yet only a small fraction of these women served as field agents behind enemy lines. Most worked in clerical, communications, logistics, or training roles. French Section, F Section, would ultimately deploy 41 female agents into France. 12 would be executed by the Germans, 4 others would die in service, and about 25 would survive to see liberation. Skarbek's eventual assignment to France would place her within this small, high-casualty cohort. For now, she remained at the periphery of active operations, working in Cairo on liaison tasks and planning assignments rather than direct field work. The frustration is documented in later accounts, trained, motivated, and experienced, yet held back by bureaucratic caution. As Allied planning turned toward operations in southern France, however, her specific skill set, mountain operations, French language proficiency, proven field experience, would suddenly become exactly what planners needed. In 1943 personnel charts, Skarbek appears on SOE strength in Cairo, attached to Middle East headquarters, working on liaison and planning tasks rather than direct field operations. The assignment reflected an institutional tension. Senior officers judged her valuable but sometimes too flamboyant for certain roles, while others saw her as ready for high-risk work. This gap between headquarters caution and field requirement would persist until circumstances forced a decision. By this time, SOE circuits in France were expanding despite heavy German security pressure. Francis Kamertz, a Belgian-British conscientious objector who had volunteered for SOE after his brother's death in the RAF, was building the jockey network across southeastern France. The region's mountainous terrain, Alps and pre-Alps, suited resistance operations, difficult for German forces to control comprehensively, offering hiding places and escape routes, and populated by communities with Republican traditions and anti-German sentiment. Jockey would eventually coordinate thousands of resistance fighters across a region stretching from Lyon to the Italian frontier. Allied planning for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France set for the 15th of August, 1944, required SOE circuits to support the landings through sabotage, intelligence, and harassment of German forces. Dragoon would deploy over 150,000 American and French troops in the initial assault, later expanding to more than 570,000. SOE's role was to prepare the ground, disrupt German communications, prevent reinforcement movements, provide guides and local intelligence, and tie down garrison forces through attacks on isolated outposts. The AMF section, Allied Forces, French, supervised SOE work in support of Dragoon. As planning intensified, requirements became specific. Couriers who could work in mountainous terrain, spoke fluent French, and had proven field experience. Skarbek's record from Poland and Hungary, ski operations, courier work under German occupation, mountain navigation, suddenly aligned precisely with operational needs. Patrick Howarth, the SOE officer who reinstated her to field-eligible status, later joked that approving her deployment was the most useful thing I did in World War II. Comparative statistics place her deployment in context. SOE employed thousands, but only dozens of women actually operated in France. Of F Section's 41 female agents, nearly half would not survive. Those who did often entered France by parachute or small boat, worked under constant risk of betrayal or capture, and faced execution if caught. German security services treated captured agents as spies, not prisoners of war. Women faced particular risks. Interrogation methods could be brutal, and execution typically meant Ravensbrück concentration camp or summary shooting. In July 1944, after nearly 3 years without a frontline mission, time spent largely watching others deploy while she handled staff work, Skarbek finally received assignment orders for France. The mission, parachute insertion to join Kamertz's jockey network as courier, replacing Cecily Lefort, who had been captured. Departure would be within days. After years of training, bureaucratic delays, and near misses, she was returning to clandestine operations, this time in France, ahead of the largest Allied landing on the Mediterranean coast. SOE records confirm that on the night of the 6th of July, 1944, Krystyna Granville parachuted into southeastern France to join the jockey circuit under Francis Cammaers. The drop occurred near the Vercors Plateau, a naturally fortified massif rising above the valleys of the Drôme and Isère rivers. Limestone cliffs ring much of the plateau, creating a natural fortress that French resistance forces had begun to occupy and organize. German occupation authorities considered the Alpine region difficult terrain for large-scale guerrilla activity. The mountains complicated logistics for EA resistance forces just as they did for German troops. Yet by summer 1944, Kamertz's jockey network commanded an estimated 10,000 men and women under arms across the region, from Lyon south to the Mediterranean and east to the Italian frontier. Numbers varied by source and season. Resistance membership was fluid, swelling when Allied success seemed imminent and contracting under German pressure. But the scale represented a significant irregular force. Kamertz himself represented an unusual figure. A former pacifist and schoolteacher who spoke fluent French, had refused military service on conscience grounds, then volunteered for SOE after his RAF brother died in action. His circuit name, Roger, became synonymous with effective SOE command in southeastern France. Under him served British officers like Desmond Long and French resistance leaders, including Gilbert Galetti and Paul Hérold. The network combined communist-aligned maquis, Gaullist resistance groups, and local volunteers into a functional, if sometimes fractious, force. Procedures for receiving airdropped weapons followed established patterns. SOE would transmit coded messages via BBC radio broadcasts, personal messages that sounded innocuous but signaled reception committees to prepare for drops. On the ground, teams would lay out ground panels or signal lamps in prearranged patterns, identifying drop zones to incoming aircraft. The containers, CLE containers named after the officer who designed them, held weapons, ammunition, explosives, and sometimes other supplies. Recovery required speed. Teams had to remove containers before German patrols could respond to reports of aircraft activity. On the 14th of July, 1944, Bastille Day, 72 American B-17 bombers conducted a daylight drop of 870 containers over Vercors. The operation represented the largest single-day airdrop to the French resistance during the war. Crewmen watched as containers tumbled from bomb bays, parachutes blossoming white against the summer sky, drifting down toward reception teams on the plateau. For resistance fighters below, the spectacle seemed to promise imminent Allied support. The scale of the drop, combined with Charles de Gaulle's rhetoric about a national insurrection, encouraged beliefs that liberation was at hand. Granville's role in this period appears in reports describing her as out every moonlit night, organizing receptions, carrying explosives and messages between groups, and acting as liaison between dispersed Maquis units. Her mobility, on foot, by bicycle, occasionally by car when fuel allowed, kept communications functioning across terrain where radio links were unreliable and roads dangerous. The physical demands were substantial: alpine distances, summer heat during day and cold at night, constant risk of German patrols or denunciation by collaborators. Historical accounts note that she arrived in the midst of a large operation, supplying by parachute the local Maquis with arms and supplies. The timing placed her directly in the escalating confrontation on Vercors. Resistance leaders had declared a free republic of Vercors, raising the tricolor and treating the plateau as liberated territory. Kammertz opposed this premature uprising, arguing that Allied forces were not yet close enough to support it and that German reaction would be brutal. His warnings proved correct. The scale of Allied airdrops and de Gaulle's calls for national uprising created expectations that outran military reality. Operation Dragoon remained 6 weeks away. Allied planners had limited capacity to reinforce Vercors with armor, artillery, or regular infantry. German forces, meanwhile, retained substantial strength in the region and viewed the Vercors uprising as a direct challenge requiring forceful response. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform Granville's mission from supply coordination to survival and evacuation. On the 22nd of July, 1944, German forces attacked the Vercors Plateau in strength. Paratroopers from Fallschirmjäger units landed by glider atop the plateau, while mountain troops and Wehrmacht infantry assaulted access points. Later, French and Allied reports list heavy Maquis casualties and widespread civilian reprisals as German forces systematically cleared resistance positions. Estimates of resistance dead range from 600 to 800, with additional civilian victims in reprisal actions. The Free Republic of Vercors collapsed within days. Maquis leaders had expected Allied landings and heavy support. Resistance planning assumed that once Vercors declared itself free territory, Allied forces would recognize it as an operational asset worthy of reinforcement. In reality, Allied planners prioritized Operation Dragoon for mid-August and had no means to reinforce Vercors with regular forces before that date. The resistance faced German mountain troops, paratroopers, and armored reconnaissance units with infantry weapons and limited anti-tank capability. The outcome was predetermined by force ratios and firepower disparity. Kammertz and Granville escaped under fire, withdrawing south towards Saint-Lé-Alpes. From this new base, she received tasking for an extended Alpine mission, travel on foot through the mountains, make contact with isolated resistance groups, and reach Polish conscripts serving in German units along the Franco-Italian frontier. The mission combined intelligence gathering, liaison work, and psychological operations, attempting to convince Polish soldiers to desert rather than fight Allied forces. The 3-week journey covered difficult terrain, mostly on foot, with a rucksack containing food, hand grenades, and documents. She met resistance leaders Gilbert Galetti and Paul Hérault, coordinating supply arrangements and intelligence sharing. Allied planners had initiated Operation Toplink, parachuting additional teams to supply both French and Italian resistance groups operating across the frontier. Her role was to ensure coordination, that drops reached the right groups, that reports flowed back to Allied headquarters, and that resistance efforts supported rather than complicated Dragoon operations. On the 13th of August, 1944, after a 2-day climb to the Col de l'Arche, a pass on the Franco-Italian border at over 1,800 meters elevation, She approached a fortress guarding the position. The garrison numbered approximately 150 soldiers, including 63 Polish Volksdeutsche, ethnic Poles from German-annexed territories conscripted into Wehrmacht service. Speaking Polish and identifying herself, she revealed her mission. Allied forces would soon advance through the area, and Polish soldiers had the opportunity to desert, sabotage the fortifications, and avoid fighting against the Allies. The approach combined personal appeal and practical assessment. She emphasized Polish identity and the prospect of serving a free Poland after the war, but also made clear that Allied forces would take the position by assault if necessary, with predictable consequences for defenders. The Polish soldiers agreed to her proposal. When resistance forces moved on the fortress, they would defect and assist in neutralizing the position. French sources later describe Operation Croix de Guerre as primordial to opening the pass for Allied forces, noting her central role in subverting the garrison. When resistance forces subsequently moved on the fortress, the Polish conscripts followed through on their commitment. The position fell with minimal casualties, avoiding what could have been a costly assault on prepared defenses. The tactical effect was modest, one strong point among many. But the operational principle was significant. Psychological operations and targeted subversion could achieve results impossible through firepower alone, especially when adversary forces included reluctant conscripts with divided loyalties. 3 days after Croix de Guerre fell on the 15th of August, Operation Dragoon commenced with Allied landings on the southern French coast. Yet before those forces could advance inland to Digne, the jockey network would face its most severe crisis: the arrest of Francis Kamertz and the threat of immediate execution. On the 11th of August, 1944, 4 days before Dragoon landings, German security forces arrested Francis Kamertz, British Major Zan Fielding, and a French liaison officer at a roadblock near Digne. Local Gestapo took them to headquarters in Digne-les-Bains for interrogation. SOE records and later testimonies confirmed that execution was scheduled within days. German security protocols called for rapid processing of captured agents, interrogation for intelligence value, then execution to prevent rescue or escape attempts. German planners intended to decapitate the jockey network precisely as Allied forces prepared to land. Kamertz commanded the entire southeastern France operation. His death would throw resistance coordination into chaos at the critical moment. SOE headquarters in Algiers initially believed little could be done. Digne was under German control, the prisoners were in Gestapo custody, and Allied forces remained too distant for any rapid intervention. Standard procedure was to write off captured agents as lost and reassign their networks to surviving officers. Granville learned of the arrests and immediately sought contact with Albert Schenk, a French liaison officer with access to German authorities, and the local Gestapo chief. She presented herself as Kamertz's wife, a complete fabrication, and claimed family connection to General Bernard Montgomery, implying that severe reprisals would follow if the prisoners were executed. The approach combined multiple psychological levers: appeal to self-preservation instinct among German officers who could see the war's trajectory, exploitation of bureaucratic caution about killing prisoners with alleged high-level connections, and the implicit threat that Allied forces now very close would hold individuals accountable. SOE authorized 2 million francs to support her negotiation. The sum represented substantial purchasing power in occupied France, enough to influence decisions and provide German officers with resources for potential escape or post-war security. The money was parachute dropped. She had to move it from drop zones to Digne under curfew conditions, while U.S. forces remained approximately 60 kilometers distant, advancing inland from the coast. Through Schenk and intermediary Max Wayem, she conducted a negotiation that was less straightforward bribe than complex exchange. German officers needed deniability if circumstances changed. If Allied forces failed to arrive quickly, or if higher headquarters inquired about prisoner disposition. The arrangement she constructed combined financial inducement with threats of personal consequences and preservation of German bureaucratic procedures. Officially, the prisoners would be released pending further investigation rather than simply freed, maintaining a paper trail that protected German officers from accusations of dereliction. The prisoners were released on the 17th of August. Kammertz later stated simply that Granville saved our lives and never even blinked, an assessment that appears in his recommendation for her George Medal and in subsequent historical accounts. The operation became one of SOE's most frequently cited examples of individual initiative producing strategic effect. Had Kammertz been executed, the jockey network's coordination during the critical liberation phase would have been severely degraded. As it was, he remained in place to guide resistance forces as they shifted from clandestine operations to open cooperation with advancing Allied troops. 2 days after the release, on the 19th of August, U.S. forces entered Digne. The timing vindicated Granville's implied threats about proximity of Allied forces and pending accountability. For German officers who had participated in the release, the arrival of American troops confirmed they had made the correct decision for their own survival. The incident demonstrated how rapidly the operational environment in southern France was changing. From German occupation certainty to Allied liberation within days, with individuals caught between forced to make calculations about their immediate and post-war futures. As elements of the U.S. 7th Army and 6th Corps advanced inland from the 15th of August Dragoon landings, they encountered armed Maquis groups and SOE teams in the Digne Gap sector. American doctrine emphasized regular formations with clear command structures, heavy firepower, and systematic logistics. Irregular forces, partisans, resistance groups, guerrillas, occupied an uncertain place in U.S. military thinking. Some officers, including General Frederick B. Butler, commanding a provisional task force, initially regarded Maquis as undisciplined bandits whose presence complicated rear area security rather than aided operations. Granville and Kammertz presented concrete data to counter these perceptions. Counts of German prisoners taken by Maquis forces, bridges and roads under resistance control, towns already cleared of German forces before U.S. arrival. Resistance strength in the jockey area is often cited at around 10,000 men and women under arms by the time of Dragoon landings, though such figures fluctuated significantly based on circumstances. Documented actions included rail line derailments that delayed German reinforcement movements, demolitions of bridges and fuel dumps, ambushes of isolated German units, and direct assaults on small garrisons. Among the resistance membership were large numbers of Polish conscripts who had deserted German service, including the 63 from Col de l'Arche and others from units further east. These men provided both intelligence about German dispositions and potential manpower for continued operations. Some were integrated into French forces of the interior units. Others were eventually directed toward Polish formations, assembling in Italy, or awaiting transport to join the Polish II Corps, fighting with the British 8th Army. U.S. after-action reports for Operation Dragoon credit French resistance with substantial disruption of German communications prior to and during the landings. Railway sabotage forced German units to move by road, slowing reinforcement and consuming fuel. Telephone and telegraph line cutting degraded German command and control. Local intelligence provided by resistance sources gave Allied commanders detailed information about German strength, dispositions, and movements that conventional intelligence collection could not match. The validation of SOE's irregular warfare model came not from SOE's own assessments, but from U.S. Army reports documenting resistance contributions to operational success. Butler's change of attitude and broader U.S. integration of Maquis into the Allied advance demonstrated how clandestine structures became overt auxiliaries once front lines reached them. What had been small-scale harassment and intelligence gathering transformed into direct military cooperation. Maquis forces providing flank security, conducting reconnaissance, guarding supply lines, and even participating in assaults on remaining German positions. The transition was neither automatic nor smooth. Cultural and doctrinal differences persisted, but operational necessity drove cooperation. For Granville personally, the period represented the operational high point. She had parachuted into occupied France, survived the Vercors crisis, conducted extended Alpine missions, subverted a frontier fortress, and rescued the network's commander from execution. Citations and commendations were already being drafted. Yet the operational environment was shifting rapidly, from clandestine warfare to conventional operations, from German occupation to Allied liberation, and from SOE's central role to its increasing marginalization as regular military forces took control. The skills that made her invaluable in occupied territory became less relevant in liberated France, and entirely irrelevant once attention turned to the post-war settlement. SOE planning papers from late 1944 outline Operation Freston, a program to insert small teams into Soviet-occupied Poland to report on political developments and the treatment of the Polish underground. The concept reflected Polish government-in-exile hopes that such missions could preserve some influence over events in their homeland and British desires for intelligence on Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. Both hopes overestimated Allied ability to conduct clandestine operations in areas under Soviet control. The planned insertion method followed patterns established in Western Europe. Small teams parachuted in with wireless sets, operating from safe houses, reporting on political and military developments. Skarbek and Kowarski were selected as potential participants in later phases, based on their pre-war and early war experience in Poland and their language skills. On paper, the mission seemed feasible. In practice, it confronted a fundamental difference. The Soviets were notionally allies, but treated their occupation zones as sovereign territory where foreign intelligence operations constituted hostile acts. The first Freston party was promptly detained by Soviet security forces. NKVD counterintelligence proved highly effective at identifying and neutralizing foreign agents. Polish underground networks that had operated under German occupation found themselves facing Soviet security services that combined similar brutality with greater resources and local knowledge. British planners had assumed that Allied status would provide some protection or at least negotiating space. Soviet authorities treated SOE missions as espionage activities requiring suppression. Subsequent Freston deployments, including those earmarked for Skarbek, were cancelled. Internal British analyses conceded that SOE could not operate in the face of Soviet opposition in Eastern Europe short of overt diplomatic channels that would compromise the entire clandestine apparatus. The frank admission marked a strategic limit. Britain's ability to influence events in Soviet-occupied territory effectively ended with the Red Army's arrival. Intelligence collection would continue through diplomatic and technical means, but human intelligence operations of the SOE type were no longer viable. For Skarbek, the cancellation ended any realistic prospect of returning operationally to Poland. The country for which she had begun courier operations in 1939 crossed the Carpathians on skis in winter conditions and maintained intelligence networks under German occupation was now effectively closed to her. The Polish government in exile would continue functioning in London, but its influence over events in Poland diminished to near zero as Soviet power consolidated. Her operational career had begun with Poland's defeat and continued through years of exile and clandestine warfare. It would end without her ever returning home, except as a private visitor, if at all. The broader institutional context saw SOE approaching dissolution. Created as a wartime expedient in July 1940, it had grown to substantial size and conducted operations worldwide. With victory in Europe achieved in May 1945 and in the Pacific by August 1945, political support for maintaining a separate sabotage and subversion organization evaporated. In January 1946, SOE was formally dissolved, its functions distributed among the Secret Intelligence Service, military intelligence, and other agencies. Personnel faced demobilization or absorption into other organizations, often at lower ranks and reduced pay. While geopolitical maps were redrawn and bureaucratic structures reorganized, personnel lists quietly moved names from active agent status to demobilized civilian. Skarbek's file, which had tracked her through Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, Cairo, and France, accumulating operational reports and commendation recommendations, would soon close with notations about decorations awarded and civilian status confirmed. British honors lists for 1945 through 1947 record awards to Miss Krystyna Granville, the George Medal for Gallantry, appointment as Officer of the Order of the British Empire in the Civil Division, and from France, the Croix de Guerre with Palm. Citation language praises her coolness and great courage in high-risk operations, specifically noting the Digna prison negotiation and Alpine missions. The George Medal citation emphasizes her role in saving Kemmerts and Fielding from execution. The OBE recognizes broader service across multiple theaters and extended duration of field operations. Comparative data from F section shows the casualty context. 41 female agents deployed to France, 12 executed by the Germans, 4 others dying in service or captivity, approximately 25 surviving to liberation. Within this group of survivors, Skarbek's service duration and operational scope placed her among the most extensively deployed. She had operated continuously from late 1939 through 1945, nearly 6 years, across multiple countries and under various organizational structures, from initial SIS missions through SOE field operations. Yet decoration did not translate to financial security or civilian career prospects. SOE veterans, particularly foreign nationals, often faced limited institutional support. British pension schemes typically excluded non-citizens or provided minimal benefits. Skarbek struggled to obtain British citizenship, reportedly threatening to return her medals if refused, a threat that may have influenced bureaucratic decisions. She was finally naturalized in December 1946, formally adopting Krystyna Granville as her legal name, though records continued to show the false birth year from her wartime documentation. Zan Fielding's 1954 memoir, Hide and Seek, dedicated to her memory, describes her as one of the bravest people he had known. The dedication underlines a gap between personal respect from those who served with her and institutional provisions for post-war support. Fellow agents praised her courage, resourcefulness, and operational effectiveness. Bureaucrats processed her file according to regulations that made limited accommodation for individuals whose service fell outside conventional military structures. Recognition on paper contrasted with practical marginalization. Once SOE dissolved in January 1946, there existed no institutional home suited to her experience. Regular military service was closed to someone who had operated primarily in clandestine roles. Intelligence services were restructuring and downsizing, with preference for career officers over wartime recruits. Civilian employment required credentials, educational certificates, professional qualifications, employment references that her years of clandestine service had not provided. The broader pattern affected many SOE veterans, especially women and foreign nationals. The organization had recruited unconventional candidates for unconventional warfare. Artists, linguists, adventurers, refugees, people whose background suited clandestine operations but not conventional post-war careers. Women faced additional barriers. Social expectations channeled them toward domestic roles, clerical positions, or traditionally female professions like nursing and teaching. An SOE veteran's medals might provoke admiration, but employers sought typists, sales clerks, and manual laborers, not former agents accustomed to operating independently under extreme conditions. Within a few years, the woman who had negotiated with the Gestapo in Digna subverted a frontier fortress through persuasion and maintained courier lines across occupied Europe would be working as hotel staff and a ship's stewardess on commercial ocean liners, jobs that required no particular qualifications and offered minimal security or advancement prospects. Employment records and testimonies from 1947 through 1952 show Granville taking a succession of positions: telephone operator, sales assistant in dress shops, waitress, and eventually cabin steward with the Union Castle Line operating passenger routes between Britain and South Africa. None provided career progression or financial security. She attempted to join Michael Dunford, a former liaison officer with whom she had maintained contact in Nairobi, Kenya, but colonial administration authorities refused her a work permit, forcing return to London and casual employment. Public rhetoric in post-war Britain celebrated resistance heroes through films, memorials, and anniversary commemorations. Economic pressures and administrative systems, however, left many ex-agents underemployed. For foreign nationals particularly, limited access to pension schemes and employment preferences for British citizens created structural disadvantage. Granville possessed no homeland to which she could return. Poland was under Soviet domination, her family estates confiscated, and no financial reserves accumulated during years of clandestine service conducted on government stipends insufficient for savings. On the passenger ship Ruahine, company regulations required crew members to wear their wartime decorations in uniform. Her medal bar, George Medal, OBE, Croix de Guerre, campaign stars, reportedly provoked reactions ranging from admiration to resentment among colleagues. Some questioned whether such decorations could be genuine on a stewardess. Others were impressed but puzzled why someone with such a record held such a position. The decorations became a source of friction rather than pride, marking her as anomalous in a job that assumed its holders were starting careers rather than ending distinguished ones. Among her colleagues was Dennis George Muldowney, a fellow steward who transferred to work as a porter at the Reform Club in London. Initial accounts suggest he defended her against accusations that she had exaggerated her wartime service. As their acquaintance continued, however, his attitude shifted from defense to obsessive attachment. He began following her, appearing unexpectedly, making declarations of affection that she did not reciprocate. When she made clear his advances were unwelcome, his behavior escalated to threats. BBC and biographical accounts summarize her post-war condition simply: without financial reserves or a native country to return to. The phrase captures the essential vulnerability. She possessed skills honed for clandestine warfare, languages, physical courage, ability to operate under pressure, capacity for deception, and psychological manipulation, none of which translated to civilian employment security. Her wartime achievements existed in classified files and the memories of those who served with her. To potential employers, landlords, and bureaucrats processing paperwork, she appeared as an aging foreign woman in casual employment, notable mainly for expensive medals whose authenticity they might doubt. The transition from clandestine operations to casual employment, combined with rejection of an unstable admirer, created conditions for violent conclusion. Muldowney's obsession met her firm refusal. His response, documented in police and court records, would end a career that official files recorded in terms of courage and operational success, with personal tragedy in a small London hotel room. On the 15th of June, 1952, police documents and court records state that Krystyna Granville was stabbed to death at the Shelbourne Hotel, 1 Lexham Gardens, Kensington, by Dennis George Muldowney. She died in the hotel lobby. Her age was recorded as 37, the age from her falsified wartime passport, not her true age of 44. Muldowney was arrested immediately at the scene, later tried for murder, and executed by hanging at HMP Pentonville on the 30th of September, 1952. Identification of the body was confirmed by her cousin, Andrzej Skarbek. Funeral arrangements proceeded through Polish exile community networks. She was interred at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery, Kensal Green, London, in a grave that would later fall into disrepair before restoration by admirers and historians. The woman decorated with the George Medal, OBE, and Croix de Guerre died without security protection, substantial pension, or institutional support, killed by an obsessed acquaintance in circumstances that bore no relation to the risks she had survived during 6 years of clandestine operations. Later memorials mark gradual recognition. Her grave was restored and maintained by those who learned her history. The Polish Hearth Club in London dedicated a bronze bust in her honor. In 2020, English Heritage unveiled a blue plaque at One Lexham Gardens honoring Christine Granville, born Krystyna Skarbek, SOE agent. The plaque text notes, "She was the first female British special agent of the Second World War, an acknowledgement of historical significance that came nearly 70 years after her initial deployment." Quantitative context places her service within SOE's broader operations. Among roughly 13,000 SOE personnel worldwide, she belonged to the small group of approximately 100 women who served as field agents behind enemy lines. Within French section specifically, she was one of 41 women deployed to France, a group in which nearly half did not survive the war. Her continuous service from late 1939 through 1945 made her not only the first female British field agent, but also the longest-serving woman agent in SOE. These distinctions appear in historical assessments but were barely noted during her lifetime. Official citations and later evaluations note her resourcefulness, coolness, and high courage under conditions of exceptional danger. The phrasing, typical of military commendations, accurately summarizes observed behavior: skiing across the Carpathians in winter, maintaining networks under Gestapo pressure, parachuting into occupied France, conducting solo alpine missions, subverting enemy positions through psychological operations, and negotiating prisoner releases at immediate personal risk. Each operation demonstrated initiative-producing effects disproportionate to the resources employed, precisely what clandestine warfare doctrine sought to achieve. Her operations illustrate how individual agents operating within larger clandestine systems could produce measurable tactical and operational effects. The courier line from Budapest provided early intelligence on German movements toward the Soviet Union. The Digne negotiation preserved jockey network leadership during the critical liberation phase. The Col de l'Arche subversion neutralized a defensive position without assault casualties. These were not war-winning achievements individually, but collectively they demonstrated the value of clandestine warfare when properly supported and intelligently directed. At the same time, her post-war fate demonstrates institutional limits of recognition once clandestine organizations dissolve. Britain decorated her service while providing minimal financial support. Bureaucratic systems processed her claims according to regulations that made limited accommodation for unconventional service. Society celebrated resistance heroes in abstract, while individual heroes struggled with employment and housing. The contradiction was not unique to her case. Many SOE veterans faced similar challenges, but it stands in sharp contrast to the rhetoric of gratitude and the reality of marginalization. Her file, which opened in 1939 with the phrase "absolutely fearless," closed not in classified annexes, but in public commemorations that came decades after her death. Historians, biographers, and documentary filmmakers have reconstructed her story from SOE records, Polish archives, French resistance accounts, and testimonies of those who served with her. These reconstructions serve dual purposes. They preserve the historical record of SOE operations and women's contributions to Allied victory, and they pose implicit questions about how societies treat those who serve in clandestine roles when circumstances change and their skills become obsolete. The outcomes of clandestine warfare are measured both in missions completed and in how societies treat those who carried them out. By the first measure, Skarbek's service was exemplary. Continuous operations across multiple theaters, documented tactical successes, commendations from commanders who witnessed her work, and survival through circumstances that killed many of her colleagues. By the second measure, her story reveals a more complicated outcome. Recognition without support, decoration without security, historical commemoration purchased at the cost of contemporary neglect. Her life compresses the trajectory of clandestine warfare in the Second World War, rapid improvisation producing measurable impact in defined theaters, followed by a post-war settlement in which even the most decorated agents could quietly disappear into civilian anonymity, their contributions known primarily to archivists and historians rather than the publics they served.